We begin this talk by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land. As settlers, recognition of the contributions and importance of Indigenous peoples must be connected to a collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. We recognize land acknowledgements as one small way of demonstrating respect for the diverse histories and cultures of all Indigenous peoples. Today, I am joining you from Mi'kmaq, the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. Since we are meeting virtually, please feel free to share where you are joining from today. And if you would like to learn more about the land you engage on a daily basis, I encourage you to visit nativeland.ca, which I've included a link in our chat. The work of truth and reconciliation is ongoing, and we all have a responsibility to each other and the land. I would also like to take a moment to thank everyone for joining our virtual presentation today. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Natasha Bowser, who will be presenting on how are Canadians adapting to the emergence of ticks and tick-borne diseases. Natasha graduated as a veterinarian from the Royal Veterinary College in the UK in 2010. She then practiced veterinarian medicine in the UK and Canada for 8 years before deciding to pursue her interest in public health. Having completed a master's degree in One Health, Natasha is now a PhD candidate in the Veterinarian Sciences Epidemiology Option Program at the Université de Montréal, working under the supervision of Dr. Cecile Anina Sainslin and Dr. Catherine Bouchard. Her work utilizes a mixed methods approach to evaluate how Canadians are adapting to ticks and tick-borne diseases, and quantitative methods to explore the use of citizen science data as a potential indicator for regional Lyme disease risk. We will have Natasha present, and then we will open for questions from the audience. You can ask your questions by entering them in the chat box or raising your hand using the icon. Please help us welcome Natasha to the podium.
Hi, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone, for being here to listen to me talk. I'm happy to present this work, which was done in collaboration with my PhD supervisors and also Madison Robertson from the University of Queens and Valerie Hongo at Public Health Agency of Canada. So this is working, there we go. So I'll just start by sharing a little bit more about me, as I was the primary coder and interpreter of these findings, and it was a qualitative study. So I think it's important that you just know a few things about me so you can understand how maybe my experiences have shaped some of the interpretations. So I identify as a white female. As you know, I'm a veterinarian. I worked in practice for several years. I live in a region of Quebec, which is endemic for Lyme disease. I'm a parent of young children, and I personally know 2 people who have experienced long-term consequences of Lyme disease infection. And I think you'll see how this might be more relevant to how you hear me talk about the findings a bit later on. So I'll try and just provide some context that's relevant to this particular study, because of course I know that you are very aware of ticks and tick-borne diseases. And then I'll talk about the study in a bit more detail. So when we talk about tick-borne diseases in Canada, I think it's inevitable that I and other people end up talking about Lyme disease because it is the most frequently reported tick-borne disease in North America. However, it is important to note that there are other tick-borne pathogens present and emerging in Canada, some of which are spread by the same tick vector, so Ixodes scapularis or Ixodes pacificus, and some which are transmitted through other tick species. But just focusing on Lyme disease for now, geographically, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario are consistently reporting the highest number of cases. And you can see in the graph on the right how the number of cases has been increasing over time, and it's expected to continue to increase. And when we think about impacts related to ticks and tick-borne disease, we can consider health impacts related to infection in humans as well as animals. We can also consider economic impacts related to infection, and these are understood to varying degrees. Another impact which hasn't been explored so well would be impacts of just living in a tick endemic region. So even without having been infected with a tick-borne disease or even bitten by a tick, we don't really understand whether there are impacts just from living near ticks. And that's the first kind of part of this study. The second part is looking more at the prevention that we can adopt to prevent tick-borne disease. And there are interventions at the level of the individual, adopting different behaviors. And in that, I would include pet behaviors too. There are interventions that we can make on our property to reduce tick exposure outside. And then, of course, there are interventions at the larger level looking to reduce tick numbers and numbers of host species. But the personal protection measures are widely recommended as being the first line of defense against tick-borne diseases. However, research has consistently shown that despite having an awareness of Lyme disease, consistently an inadequate number of people are consistently adopting these behaviors on a regular basis when they go into tick habitats in endemic regions. And this is a problem because, like I said, the number of cases is expected to continue to increase, in part due to climate change and urbanization of tick habitats, among other things. So with that little context in mind, we had two main research questions. One was to identify any non-clinical impacts of living in a region where ticks are present. And secondly, to identify barriers and facilitators to adopting these types of preventive behaviors against tick-borne diseases at the individual level. So our methodology. So this was a qualitative study. We conducted 22 focus groups virtually at the end of 2021, early 2022, with participants who we had recruited through various online platforms and who were at high risk of tick exposure. And by that, I mean we spoke to pet owners, outdoor enthusiasts, outdoor workers, and parents and caregivers of children under the age of 18. But everyone in our study was over 18 years of age. And we recruited participants from 5 endemic regions of Canada. So you can see here on the map, we targeted regions within BC, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. And after the focus groups, participants were compensated for their time and sent some resources on tick bite prevention. And for the analysis, we kept the audio recordings of all these focus groups, and we analyzed them by coding the data into different themes related to our objectives. And then these themes were organized into a model of behavior called the COMBI model. And I'll include a figure here you can see. I won't spend too long talking about this, but this model of behavior specifies that for a behavior to occur, there has to be capability, motivation, and opportunity, and these can interact with each other. So this is kind of the framework that we use to help organize all the themes that came out of our focus group discussions. And some preliminary results were sent to participants as well. So as an example of what was discussed in the focus groups and how we started the conversations, we had 2 overarching questions. So for objective 1, where we wanted to find out about the impacts, we just started with a very open question: what has changed for you, your pets, and your family over time with the presence of ticks and Lyme disease in your region? And then depending on what people told us, we could follow up with different prompts about activities, economic impacts, and things like that. We also asked what might help to mitigate some of these impacts, or at least to make the participants feel better. And with our second objective, looking at facilitators and barriers, we asked, what do you do to protect yourself, your pets, and your family from tick bites and Lyme disease? And again, we could follow up on what they were saying to us. We could ask why they were doing some things and not others. And the behaviors and contexts that we were most interested in were the ones that are kind of widely recommended as being something that people can do to protect themselves. So performing tick checks, using bug repellents, wearing certain clothing, and other behaviors like that. So I'll move on to the findings. I'll start by talking about demographics. Then I'll talk to you a bit about this observed spectrum of adaptation across Canada. And then I'll talk more about the impacts and facilitators and barriers. There are many quotations on these slides, and you do not need to read them all. They're there really to provide evidence for what I'm saying and for your interest. And I've tried to keep a balance of sentiments that really did reflect what was discussed in the focus groups. So we had 96 participants. Generally, We didn't have much difficulty recruiting. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the study and for people to participate, with the exception of BC. And I think this really reflects the lower levels of prevalence of Lyme disease in BC, and certainly a lower level of risk perception. Almost all of the participants reported as having some characteristic that put them at higher risk. So you can see we had a lot of outdoor enthusiasts and a lot of pet owners. And the majority of participants identified as being female, white, and between the ages of 35 and 75 years of age. So I talked about this spectrum of adaptation. It's very difficult for me to summarize differences between regions so simply, but instead I've just tried to pick one quote from each region which reflects kind of the largest or most prominent sentiment that was coming out of that region. And it was notable enough that I wanted to include it in this presentation. So if we start out in BC, we had a small number of participants, but across the board, people were not thinking about ticks on a day-to-day basis. Certainly they weren't reporting impacts, and many people said ticks weren't even on their radar. So certainly not perceived as a big problem with the participants that we spoke to. If we move a bit more east to our regions in Ontario, there were a mixture of feelings. So for some people, it was still very new. There was a lot of alarm, anxiety, not being sure about what to do, where to go, who to talk to. And certainly some people were reporting impacts because they were just very scared and unsure. Moving on a little bit more to Quebec, there was more the sense of adaptation, of having got used to the situation. This doesn't mean that there wasn't anxiety or alarm, but there was more of a movement towards, okay, we've been living with this for a while. We need to move on, and we need to focus more on what's happening after the tick bite, what's happening with diagnosis and treatment. Moving more across again to Nova Scotia, where the participants, most of them had been living with Ixodes scapularis and associated pathogens for a long time, were really fully adapted. They were almost, many people reported that they didn't want to be talking about prevention anymore. They adopt this on a daily basis already. Again, there was more the wanting to move on from prevention and talk about the diagnosis and the treatment. Many of them were adopting preventive behaviors on a very consistent basis and still getting bitten by ticks. And then I'll go back to Manitoba, which was very different because a lot of the participants from Manitoba talked about having grown up with ticks, other tick species, not Ixodes scapularis, but still they had grown up with ticks. It's second nature to adopt behaviors. They reported very few impacts and alarm and anxiety compared to other more easterly regions. And they're really just kind of getting on with it. There was nothing new for them, but they are having to get used to the idea of Ixodes scapularis and Lyme disease a bit more recently. So I'll move on to some of the impacts that were reported, and I'll start off by saying we were really focusing on the non-clinical impacts. So some physical health impacts naturally came up. We had participants who had had a tick-borne disease previously, but all of the reports about impacts on physical health were as a result of having had a tick-borne disease rather than from living in their region where they lived. However, mental health did come up a lot, impacts on mental health, and this came up in three ways really. Firstly, there were many impacts reported on emotional well-being, so feeling scared, anxious, resentful, angry. This came up a lot in multiple regions. There was also impacts reported on social well-being, and people talked about friends who didn't want to visit them anymore because they had been bitten at the last visit. There were also several participants who talked about how they were not encouraging their children and grandchildren to move closer to them from other provinces because they were concerned about their grandchildren being bitten by ticks. And of course, this was said with sadness. And there was also the idea of the mental labor that's involved with living where ticks are very endemic. So having to think about ticks as soon as you go outside into the yard, every time you go out, even in a house, in some cases, people were talking about having to keep an eye out for ticks. There were also impacts related to activities, which is not surprising, and by extension, people's feeling of how they're interacting with nature. So some people completely have moved away from certain activities at all. A few people talked about going for walks on the pavement now rather than on trails. Others have just modified how they're doing their activities. So maybe only going into the woods in the winter, and they're now taking up more winter sports, or maybe going to the beach instead of the woods and things like that. So they're just changing how they go outdoors. But there was definitely the sentiment that came up a lot about how people are feeling sad and maybe resentful at times that their children can't play, or they don't allow their children to play in the same way that they would have done when they were younger because of the concern. So, you know, examples came up like not building forts, not lying in the long grass, not going to collect flowers from the field. Things like that came up consistently, especially regarding children's interaction with nature. So after this, we have impacts on pets. So not just related to activities, because of course, if people are changing their activity, that has an impact on their dogs too and their cats in some situations, but more the idea that some people, a surprising number of people, talked about not choosing to have an outdoor cat or a dog again in the future because they really considered them to be a hazard in terms of bringing ticks into the household. And again, this was said with sadness, and there were some people who said they've had pets all their life, but they're going to decide not to have a pet again in the future because of this. And that was unexpected. We hadn't really expected to hear that. Some financial impacts were reported, whether that be maybe declining a work opportunity because of perceived risk of tick bites, or because of reduced work productivity, especially in outdoor workers, where they're having to stop multiple times a day, kind of check themselves, click off ticks, apply bug repellent, things like that. And finally, with adaptation, well, I say finally, this is a big one. So adaptation is an impact. It implies that people are changing their behavior to protect themselves. And this is in general a good thing, because of course we want people to protect themselves, but this doesn't mean that they couldn't also feel the negative impacts. And it also doesn't mean that they felt secure or confident in what they were doing. In fact, many participants, particularly in the highly endemic regions, expressed a sense of inevitability that they would get a tick-borne disease at some point, despite the fact that they are consistently adopting preventive behaviors on a day-to-day basis. And by extension, this led to frustration when they kept hearing about, you know, communication campaigns focusing on personal preventive behaviors. This was really quite frustrating for some participants because they were already doing these things, and it can lead to them feeling like they're not being heard. As I mentioned, participants from BC were not so impacted, and I would say most of the participants really just had nothing to say at all when we talked about this subject. And finally, it wasn't really related to our objective about personal impacts, but there were many references to impacts on local industries. For example, the real estate market. Several participants said that they would reconsider where they lived, and on kind of ER, having a waiting room full of people asking for advice on tick bites. So there were some reports about more local impacts in their community. And we asked about mitigating impacts, and two main things came up over and over again. So the first one was really participants that express a real desire for more increased communication about their local context. So which parks have the highest risk where they are, what research is happening in their region, what's being done in their region. And that would certainly make people feel better and more informed when they decide what to do and where to go. And the second theme which came up again, and I've already alluded to this, is the moving on from personal prevention behaviors. People reported, and many participants reported that they'll feel better knowing that there's someone to take care of them when they do get a tick bite and when they do get a tick-borne disease. So moving on to our second objective, which was looking at the barriers and facilitators to adopting these behaviors. Many themes came up, and I'm not going to look too deeply at this slide because it's quite busy, but this is really just to show you how all the themes were organized into our model of behavior using capability, opportunity, and motivation. And I'm just going to pick on some of these themes from each of these three categories, which were interesting to talk about and which came up a lot. So when looking at these themes in terms of how they facilitate or hinder a behavior, I'll start with capability and the idea that you really need to have knowledge and understanding to be able to implement any of these behaviors. So pet ownership came up as a facilitator a lot. Many participants said that they knew what they knew, or they knew how to remove a tick because they had learned it either through a veterinary healthcare professional or perhaps from other dog owners when they're out in the park and they're talking to each other. And by contrast, there were some comments from people who did not own pets saying how they felt like they didn't know what the other participants were talking about. They didn't have dogs, or they didn't know how to remove a tick. They hadn't been shown by anybody. Another thing which came up repeatedly was not having enough knowledge. And this was very apparent specifically for bug repellent and property modifications. So many people were not aware that certain bug repellents were effective against ticks. They may have been using them for mosquitoes, but they didn't know to use them for ticks, and the seasons don't always align. So they weren't necessarily using it at the right time of year for ticks. And this is especially the case when we talk about children. Many parents said that they just did not know what they could be doing to prevent tick bites on their children. And as I mentioned, many people were also not aware that there were things that they could do on their property to reduce tick burden. And finally, the last thing for this slide is the timing of the realization. So this came up a lot with newcomers. Many participants had moved to that region in fairly recent years and described how the first time that they even learned about ticks or pathogens was when they got bitten by a tick, or their pet got bitten by a tick. And that's the first they knew about it. And of course, that in itself creates a lot of anxiety when you suddenly realize that you've moved to an area where there's a problem like this and they don't know anything about it. So this was a real barrier for some people. In terms of having the opportunity to adopt these behaviors, and by this we mean having the means or the social circumstances to be able to do it, I've picked two themes here. So the first relates to the availability of certain resources. Now, people said that lots of things help them, having a mirror, having a tick puller, having certain types of clothing, all enable them to do different types of tick preventive behaviors. But the availability of these was sometimes a barrier or sometimes a facilitator. So for example, there were a couple of participants that talked about how their family doctor was happy to prescribe a prophylactic antibiotic before they went out on a week-long hike or canoe trip. And that made them feel a lot better, and it enabled them to protect themselves if, for example, they found an engorged tick halfway through their trip and they were days away from a healthcare professional. It made them feel better. They would be able to protect themselves there and then. But the lack of availability or perceived availability was also brought up a lot, particularly regarding the idea that there was more available down in the States compared to Canada with respect to certain types of bug repellents and sprays and clothing. And so that did come up a lot, particularly with people who spent a lot of time either working outdoors or just recreating outdoors. Access to healthcare was another one, again, which some people perceived to be really helpful and some perceived to be a barrier. So many people were aware that they could go to their pharmacist for advice or for a prophylactic antibiotic if they found an engorged tick. And they were very appreciative of this, and it worked well for them. However, others reported the idea that they had to fight with their pharmacist, especially if they didn't have the tick with them. And yet others talked about being an hour away from a pharmacy. So this was a real barrier. They were not going to drive an hour and back each time they found an engorged tick. And the distance was reported more as a problem in southeastern Manitoba. And so for motivation and the barriers and facilitators here, I have two slides on this. First of all, many people were adopting behaviors, and I think I've said this already, which had another purpose. And this really encouraged people and facilitated people to use them. Maybe they wouldn't have even used these behaviors if it hadn't been for the other purpose. So for example, using bug repellents for mosquitoes, wearing long clothing to protect from the sun or to help keep cool, or putting up deer fencing to protect their garden and not necessarily to reduce ticks coming onto the property. And so I think by promoting the dual purpose nature of some of these behaviors, I think actually it can be quite helpful in motivating people to adopt them. A barrier which came up a lot was the perceived fear of the consequences of adopting certain behaviors. So for example, using bug repellent, many people were not using it because they were afraid of health impacts or side effects. This was also the case with the prophylactic antibiotic. Many people didn't want to use it for fears of antibiotic resistance or impacts, side effects, impacts on the body. And this was also related to, this idea is related to the frequency of use. So many people reported that they live in a region where they see ticks every day. They sometimes see them in the house. And so adopting a behavior such as prophylactic antibiotics every time they find an engorged tick, or applying bug repellent every time, twice a day, to be able to protect themselves, it's just not feasible, and they're not going to do that. And the last theme on this slide relates to the confidence in official guidance and healthcare. So for this theme, it was actually a motivator for many people, in that if they did not have confidence in the recommendations that are being provided in terms of prevention or in healthcare, or even in, for example, the efficacy of an antibiotic, this was motivation enough for them to kind of feel like they have to take it upon themselves to protect themselves, because they really don't want to run the risk of having to then go through the processes of what they have to go through after being bitten by a tick. And so some would say it's a barrier in terms of it does not make them feel good about adopting, about going out and things like that. But for others, it really was the main motivator for adopting these preventive behaviors. And then kind of two more main themes here, really. So personal experience of a tick-borne disease or prior tick exposure was certainly a motivator. The real difference here was that many participants who had suffered from a tick-borne disease described how once they had the disease, it was the whole lifestyle change, not just regarding symptoms and illness, but for preventing another tick. They really took tick bite prevention to heart after they had been diagnosed. Whereas with prior tick exposure, it was more gradual. So people described more of a trend. The more ticks they saw over time, the more seriously they started to think about tick bite prevention and adopting on a regular basis. And finally, I'll bring up pet ownership one more time under motivation. As I mentioned, some participants saw their pet as being a hazard, but for others, it was really more of a facilitator, in that it was like a prompt. They saw their dog as a sentinel, and when they saw their tick on their dog, it reminded them to do a check on themselves or to adopt other types of protection for themselves and their families. And in this sense, it really was more of a facilitator and a reminder. So that was a brief tour through some of the themes on this slide. I realized that a lot of these themes come across as being barriers or have a negative connotation, and that, as I said, I'm trying to portray how this was described in the focus groups, but I also want to pick up on some of the more kind of positive and facilitator themes that came up from people who were reporting that they had really adapted and were now normalizing all these behaviors on a very regular basis. And so I'm going to pick up on 6 themes. So again, these were reported by people who really talked about having accepted the situation and are now adopting all these tick bite prevention behaviors on a very regular basis, often without even thinking about it. And this is really the hope, right? This is what we hope people are going to be doing who live in endemic regions. So first of all, was accepting that preventive behaviors need time and actually making time for them. So whereas many people talked about, oh, life gets in the way, or I lost track of time, or I just forget, others were really have really kind of habituated to these behaviors. They know to put in 10 minutes of their time when they get back to do a tick check. They know to get their clothes ready, their long clothes ready before they go out. They're taking the time to put these things into their day every day. Education as a child also came up too, and I've mentioned this already. Participants who had grown up with ticks just don't even think twice about ticks now. They know to do tick checks. They know what to look for. They know how to protect themselves. And this was really helpful for them. And this leads on to the next theme, which I've labeled liberating children. Many participants who were not accustomed to ticks really talked about how they were motivated to become accustomed to ticks, to start integrating these behaviors every day, so that this would be a normalized behavior for children, and hopefully by extension to lessen the impacts of ticks on their children as they grew up and became adults. There was also the idea of assessing your own risk tolerance. And this came up a lot with participants who were spending lots of time outdoors, so camping or hiking or hunting or working. The idea that it's good for every individual to weigh up their own risk tolerance. Like, what are the benefits of me continuing to go outside? What are the negatives? How happy am I to adopt these behavior and to incorporate these into my routine, and kind of weighing up the balance overall. And so for many participants, when they weighed up this balance, they were more than happy to still go outside, to accept that there is a risk, but to feel good knowing that they're doing what they can to mitigate that risk by adopting preventive behaviors. There were also certain actions that were described in order to feel prepared or empowered. So again, people talked about having tick puller on their keychain, having multiple cans of bug repellent in different places so that they couldn't forget it, keeping their bug repellent by the back door so they can't miss it when they go out. Just little tricks to try and help themselves in the future. And then finally, I've labeled the last theme, developing habits over time. Of course, there's no magical solution for or way to develop habits, but this is more as a kind of encouragement for people who maybe aren't normalized or sure about adopting behaviors, that even people who are adopting them now subconsciously were not doing this perhaps 10 or 20 years ago, but it is possible. So it's possible to adopt these behaviors and for them to become unconscious, even if it's not something that you grew up doing. So I think that kind of summarizes the impacts, the facilitators, the barriers, the types of adaptation that are occurring. So really, to conclude, I think we can say that many individuals and pets are being impacted by the presence of ticks and tick-borne pathogens in their region. These impacts might be mitigated by more local communications about where they are, and having a greater confidence in the healthcare system in relation to what happens after a tick bite occurs. We've highlighted some of the facilitators and barriers to adopting these behaviors. It's clear that many individuals are adapting and have normalized behaviors, but this is not consistent, and certainly there are many people who have not normalized these behaviors yet and are still very much unsure and anxious about their local situation. And finally, I think it would be good for public health to continue to be aware of the regional risk context when promoting these personal preventive behaviors, as I mentioned, to avoid the frustration and the feeling of not being heard by people who have adapted these now on a daily basis for a very long time and are still getting bitten and are still getting infected. And in terms of next steps, so these findings have informed the content and the approach for a tick bite prevention initiative we're developing called Tick Tool and Pratique. And this is with our research group and eTick. And this will be launched in stages starting in the fall. And Jad Savage has already presented some information about that in her presentation. And also the findings from this qualitative study also informed the design of a quantitative study, a survey, which we conducted earlier this year so that we could measure some of these themes at the national level. And the data analysis for this will start probably this summer. So I have some references if anyone would like to see those. Thank you for listening. I'd especially like to thank the participants of the focus groups who shared so much in the way of experiences and their time, everyone who helped with the promotion of the study, my advice committee at the university, the funding bodies, so the University of Montreal, the CIHR, and particularly Clydeurn, who also supports my PhD, and PCAC from Clydeurn, because they actually provided quite a lot of input when I presented this project to them a long time ago when we were just developing it. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Natasha, for your presentation. And as a reminder, we're opening up the conversation to questions, so you can feel free to put your questions in the chat or also raise your hand and you can unmute to ask your question. So as a reminder, questions about Natasha's presentation and the presentation of the current findings. And I see one question here that's specific to your presentation, Natasha. Is this work being published as an article?
Yes, that's on my agenda for the next month or two, is to write it up. It will be published. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks. And Dr. Kadir.
Hello, hello to everyone. Thank you, Natasha, for this very good presentation. Since the focus is about ticks, prevention of tick bite, and what we can do on an individual level, what we can promote as an action at an individual level, but also as a public health measure level. What would be your one or two best proposals or ideas about action on a public health level? Because you mentioned that idea of giving antibiotics as prescribing antibiotics for those who go outdoors and might have difficulty having access to a pharmacy or a healthcare provider. This is an idea that has come up from time to time in different circles. Do you think, based on your research, that that would be one practical measure, or no, there are other measures that you have thought about, that you have think about?
Okay, so thank you for your question. So yes, so that came up on that was a very case-by-case option that came up with select participants who really were avid outdoor enthusiasts. So I mean, most people weren't going on week-long hikes, and they really appreciated that their family doctor would do that for them. Other people commented that it was a good idea, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be that all people need to have antibiotics to hand. I don't know if that would be a good idea, if people would be using them appropriately or not. But I think what came up a lot was the idea of having local places to go for information. And as I mentioned, I think not everyone was aware that they could even go see their pharmacist. And they were really pleasantly surprised when they learned this in the focus group. So I know certainly around here where I live, many people are aware of that, but I don't think it's across the board that everyone's aware of that. So I think that's the first thing to really try and communicate. And I know already this has been communicated before, but I don't think it's reaching everybody that would benefit from hearing it. In terms of other options, many people talked about having kind of a center of excellence or a tick clinic where they are, particularly in like Nova Scotia. I think it was also brought up in the Quebec context as well, so that people would know that they could just go straight there for any questions or any antibiotics or any information that they needed, they could go there. So I don't know if that's directly answered your question or not, Dr. Kadir.
Yes, it answers it. I just want to comment on the fact that, of course, we can believe sometimes as health professionals based on, I would say, of a more paternalistic approach, that people will use the drugs we prescribe them in unwanted manners. It can happen, but on the other side, in many other instances, you have witnessed yourself, and you mentioned that a lot of people don't want to take antibiotics, even if sometimes it's indicated there are not prone to take them because they want to avoid side effects, they want to avoid antibiotic resistance. So we see that the basic knowledge of the population is adequate in terms of thinking about the different aspects of antibiotic usage. So I would personally want us to adopt measures that count on the responsibility and on the plain participatory capacity of the population, and not always basing our approach into a paternalistic approach where we think people won't know how to act.
Yeah.
That was my editorial, of course. Sorry.
Yeah. And that makes total sense. And by extension, I think also many people are not comfortable identifying a tick, the tick species, that is. So I was actually really amazed. So many outdoor workers, particularly in Manitoba, could tell me exactly which species were present in which regions, in which years, and when, they knew so much more than I could know. And of course, it was obvious that many participants were very good at identifying the tick species, but many were not. And so I think if we do adopt an approach where people are able to kind of acquire their prophylactic antibiotic themselves and administer it themselves, I think that would be part of it, because of course we don't necessarily want everyone to be taking it if they were bitten by a different tick species.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have a question from Dr. Katie Clow.
Hi, Natasha. Great presentation. It was really interesting. I'm curious about, I can understand the idea about frustration with some of the messaging when you're already doing everything that you're supposed to and it's, not foolproof. Did any of your participants provide insight into what would be helpful? I'm thinking of myself as a researcher, and I talk about those preventative measures a lot, and don't want to discourage people from doing them, but at the same time, is it, framing it that it's risk reduction but not complete, like it's not foolproof? Or did that come up at all in the conversation?
I mean, many people said that they don't feel at all invincible or confident that they can prevent tick-borne diseases, even despite adopting all the preventive behaviors that they are adopting. And, a few people talked about how prevention, it should no longer be, of course, this is very region specific, but when we're talking about highly endemic regions, people are talking about how prevention should not be put on the individuals anymore. They're doing everything they can, and now prevention needs to be taken over by kind of authorities and healthcare and public health. In terms of the types of messaging, I think maybe what would help, I can't remember now if there are specific examples, but I really think what would help is just kind of acknowledgement that people are living in a situation where there is a danger around them, that the authorities understand that people are having to adapt and they're having to take on all of these different behaviors, and just acknowledging that, yes, it's not foolproof, it's not a guarantee, I think would be really helpful, because so many participants talked about how, joking, how, oh, all you have to do is stay on the trail and you'll be fine, you won't get Lyme disease, and that's kind of what they're hearing from the messaging, is that, oh, you only have to do 1, 2, 3, 4 things and then you'll be fine. And of course that does incite a lot of anger and frustration when that's not the case in certain contexts. So yeah, I think more just the acknowledgement that it is a tricky situation to adapt to, and that people are doing the best that they can, and that of course nothing is guaranteed.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Thank you.
And our next question is from Martin.
Hi, Natasha. Really interesting talk. Really fascinating to see how people are thinking and coping with this. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about areas where Lyme has been around for, well, where people known about it for longer, like in the United States and Europe. Are people's attitudes there different? Like, is Canada evolving to those attitudes, or do you have any insight there? Like what is it when people have been living with it for 20 years? Do they become more blasé about it, or just as concerned?
I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. I certainly don't know the literature from there in depth, but for example, Cecile, my supervisor, looked at, and other papers too have looked at kind of the adoption of preventive behaviors. And certainly some research suggests that people are adopting less prevention over time because they do become acclimatized to the situation and they get over adapted, if that makes sense, over acclimatized to the situation. In terms of the impacts felt, so there is very little literature about this in general, even beyond North America, looking to Europe, for example, and Scandinavian countries as well. There is little research looking at this. There has been some looking at whether or not people would choose to live in certain regions, but not really much in the way of impacts that we've been looking at here, to be honest. So I can't really comment on that so much about the impacts on people there. It is quite possible that this is a spectrum that everybody has to go through, and that there is a wave of impact adaptation, and then it all settles down again. But I can't say that I know enough of the literature from that area to be able to say that, and whether or not that would apply here.
Right. Thanks very much.
It's a good thought though, because like I said, we're already seeing a bit of a spectrum at the Canadian level. So I think over time, of course, that those different levels of adaptation will naturally change and occur over time.
Yeah, I remember when I spent 8 years in in Europe, and I would go to these conferences. And most of the scientists that were at those conferences were from places where Lyme disease was emerging, like Scandinavia and the Netherlands. And there was huge concern, scientific concern and government concern. And then countries like Switzerland and Austria that have, been living with Lyme disease for long. There's hardly any people doing research in it. Even at the scientific level, people are just kind of like, well, we're kind of done with it. I'm not saying that's at the population level, but I found it really striking that most of the scientific effort was coming from countries where it was new and emerging.
Yes, and actually Cecile, so I think it was her PhD research actually looked at comparing some individuals living in, I can't remember which region of Quebec now, maybe Montargis, and a group of participants in Switzerland as well. So she actually published a couple of papers answering some of these questions, not specifically about impacts, but more about adoption of preventive behaviors and acceptability between these two groups. And there were clear differences.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the next question from Rob.
Hi, Natasha. Thank you very much for a fine presentation. I'm here in the tick epicenter, I think, in Canada, in Lunenburg County, Nova Scotia. And we feel that the ticks have probably always been here. That probably accounts for a lot of cases of MS. Since I've had Lyme in 2010, I guess, I've been collecting ticks, probably about 4,000, and I teach prevention. And one thing that's not mentioned in Canada enough is the use of permethrin for personal protection. I'm against broad spreading it in the environment. We're going through insect killing sprees here that are beyond belief, but for personal protection, I'm waiting around in ticks, and I spray all my clothing ahead of time, every day, every month or so, every 4 to 6 weeks. And I haven't been bitten since, and that's what I teach people to do. Now, we can't buy permethrin over the counter here at 0.5%, but I found that the ant spray, which is 0.25%, works just fine. So I downplay repellents for skin because none of them work very well. I use them, but it's really the footwear. Ticks have to climb up the count. What is the block in Canada outside of Dr. Richard Aucoin from preventing us from buying permethrin sprays over the counter to protect ourselves from tick bites? Have you any clue?
So it's a good point, and I'm afraid I really don't know the answer to that, but all I can say is that many people repeated exactly what you said, that they acquire permethrin spray in one form or another, but it's not approved in the way that they would like to purchase it in Canada. And that's partly what I was referring to when I was talking about the perceived difference in availability of products between Canada and the US, for example. But I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I don't know why. I don't know what the stumbling block is, or if there's a key concern regarding the licensing of that permethrin. I don't know.
That's a shame.
Rob, do you know, I mean, is it just, it needs to be tested by Canadians? Is that it?
The clothing is continuing to shake down the company that produces the clothing and the sprays in the States for more money, $500,000 at a time with no end in sight. So the company, after putting in about $1 million, decided there's not going to be an end to it. They may go back at this someday, but he's insisting on separate testing for Canadians. He won't accept international tests. The products are accepted in other countries. So the company that produces most of the clothing is not allowed to ship to Canada. There is some on the gray market that goes through his factory that slips through because it doesn't say ticks. So you can buy sprays as long as they say something like barn flies for horses. It's the same stuff for ants, for spiders, but just not for ticks. And the same thing goes for most of the clothing. Now, the no-fly zone will prevent tick bites, but it's not made in children's sizes, and we can't buy the socks here. So that's my big beef. It's the socks we need, and children's are the ones that are going to be bitten. This is synthetic permethrin, so the safety is well known. It's been around for hundreds of years now. So you can grow chrysanthemum and dry the petals, and that'll work just fine as an insecticide too. So it's a non-permanent, it's non-controversial. Sprayed on our crops. It's safe, considered safe for pregnant women. So there's no downside to using it.
Okay.
I should add something quickly. Just so it came up a lot, the idea of permethrin and other permethrin treated clothing and knowledge in general, the difference between the US and Canada. People often said that they were looking to the US to see what would happen next in Canada in the next few years. You know, they were looking ahead. But some people said that they were acquiring permethrin. Others said that they chose not to use it because it is toxic to cats, and they really didn't, if they have cats in the household, they didn't want to be spraying permethrin. So I guess that's one downside to it, and certainly some people said that they would not use it because of that reason.
Okay, dried permethrin will not hurt cats. The spray will definitely. Well, spray will hurt insects too, butterflies. So you do it when the cat isn't around. Once that clothing is dry, it's okay. We've had this debate, but I've heard this one before.
It came up.
Yeah. So, people that cats, outdoor cats should be wearing a collar, which is permethrin quite often, because they're one of the biggest sources of ticks. They feed on rodents. They evolved with rodents and bring them into the house. So that's why some owners now have given up on their cats, will not have another one.
Yep. No, it came up. It was surprising. I hadn't expected to hear so many people comment about the implications for their pets.
Are there any other questions for Natasha? I don't see any new questions in the chat.
Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen then for a moment.
Great.
Does
So
Dr. Lau have an, oh no, she took her hand down. I was gonna say it was still up.
Sorry.
if there
Old
aren't
hand.
any questions, I just wanted to thank Natasha so much for your presentation. It's really, I found it really interesting to see sort of the differences across Canada. And I think really your presentation, your study really speaks to the importance of being able to do that cross comparison and to think about the differences. So thank you very much. And thank you for everyone who joined us today for this presentation and for asking questions. And I'll turn it over to Veronica.
Thank you again, Lisa, for helping to moderate today and doing the Q&A and introductions. And thank you to Natasha for your fantastic presentation. Just a reminder that we still are continuing our Lyme disease and tick-borne disease discussions. We're going into week 5 next week, and we have 3 more presentations to wrap up our month. Our next presenter is Dr. Todd Hatchett, who will be presenting on what's new in tick-borne diseases in Nova Scotia. His presentation is on Monday, May 29th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So I do hope you join us for that presentation. A friendly reminder, just you still have time to take part in our challenge. Wear green, take a photo and share it with us to help spread awareness for Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases. You can send your photos into clydern@gmail.com, just along with your name and email. All entries received by May 31st will be entered into our draw, which will be occurring during our final presentation on May 31st at 1 o'clock. And you have a chance to win one of 4 $25 Starbucks e-gift cards. If you're an artist out there, you can also take photos of your creations. So there's still time. We've only received 2 entries to date. So there's still a good percentage opportunity that you could be successful in winning one of the Starbucks e-gift cards. And finally, the TICNet Canada Scientific Symposium will be holding its inaugural in-person conference in Toronto, Ontario on October 24th to 25th. The planning committee has been working behind the scenes, and we are very confident that we will have registration and abstract submission opening up on June 1st next week. And we're hoping to share on the last day the registration link with everybody. So again, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Natasha. And thank you to our audience who continuously call in every single day that we have a presentation. I hope you have a great rest of your week, a great upcoming weekend, and I hope to catch you next week when we wrap up with our final 3 presentations. Take care.